연초부터 연일 출렁이는 세계 증시에 변동성 회피를 위한 투자 전략이 주목받고 있습니다. 그래서 저희는 오늘 스마트베타펀드의 대부라 불리는 롭 아르노트 리서치 어필리에이츠 CEO를 만나보려고 합니다. 스마트베타는 지수를 따라가는 인덱스 펀드에 특정 종목과 자산을 선택적으로 골라 가중치를 두는 운용 전략입니다. 특히 가치주에 대한 평가가 높은 편이죠. 롭 아르노트 회장이 보는 올 한 해 증시와 또 주목해야 할 종목들, 필요한 투자 전략까지 함께 들어보시죠.
Which means that the high flyers are likely to come back down to earth. So what this tells me is that the place to invest is not necessarily the US, but if you do it on the value side. Don't chase the FANG stocks.
Hello, Mr. Arnott. Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to do so.
I figured we could start with the forecast of 2022. 새해 주식시장은 어떻게 전망하시는지, 특히 2022년을 관통하는 키워드가 있을까요?
Well, one of the mistakes many investors make is to assume that past is prologue, to assume that what's happened last year will happen again this year. This is a market which, at least in the US, is becoming rather frothy and speculative. So to the extent that the deficit spending turns out to be unsustainable, or the Fed needs to tighten, there is a serious risk of a reversal in US equities, which would most particularly hit the tech stocks, the FANG type stocks. S&P 500, I would say, should finish the year somewhere between down 20% and up 10%, meaning a downward bias to the risk. The thing that's interesting is if it rises in part because COVID is receding and there's a reopening trade.
Right.
That is to say, the economy is reopening, supply chain disruptions are a thing of the past. If that happens, the stocks that will soar will be the value stock. Now, if we don't get that, if tightening by the central bank or elimination of some of the deficit spending leads to a bear market, that would most particularly afflict the high-flying tech stocks. We've already seen that in the first couple of days of the new year. The tech stocks are being hit hard. The value stocks are faring just fine.
일각에서는 시장, 특히 일부 주식은 과도하게 주가가 높다고 말합니다. 어떻게 보시나요?
My take on it is actually very simple, and that is US stocks are very fully valued. They're priced to give us a lousy return in the coming 10 years. That doesn't mean an imminent massive bear market. It just means brace yourself for lower returns, that the returns of the past pushed us to valuation levels that are priced to give us a lower future return than the past. Our work, we have an interactive website called Asset Allocation Interactive. If anyone Googles those three words, they'll be drawn straight to our website, which looks at markets around the world, 130 different markets around the world. And the US is the most expensive of the bunch. So if we're the most expensive market out of 130, are we going to be the fastest growing? No, there's a lot of countries that are likely to play catch up after the COVID pandemic recedes. And so we may see a reopening trade, which would be wonderful for the less expensive markets of the world. Emerging market stocks are generally a little cheap, Korea being one of them. There's some emerging markets that are rather expensive. India is an example, but many of them are relatively cheap. And the spread between growth and value, the spread between the high flyers and the inexpensive stocks in emerging markets is the widest it's ever been. which means that the high flyers are likely to come back down to earth. So what this tells me is that the place to invest is not necessarily the US, but if you do it on the value side. Don't chase the FANG stocks. And outside the US, the opportunities are much more interesting. The valuations are much more sensible. And even there, value is much cheaper than growth.
빅테크에 대해서는 어떻게 평가하시는지 궁금합니다. 빵주들이 올해도 더 상승세를 탈 수 있다고 보시나요?
There's several things going on here. Firstly, all of the FANG type stocks are expensive. Apple is no exception. There are some that are more expensive than others. Tesla is a beautiful example of a stock where people buy it based on story, not based on any underpinnings of relative valuation. A stock that's trading at 20 to 30 times its annual sales is very frothy and very dangerous. Could it go higher? Yes. There's a notion of picking up nickels in front of a steamroller. When you have a bubble stock, it'll keep going until it doesn't. And if you try to get greedy and pick up the nickels in front of a steamroller, watch out if the steamroller catches you first. And yes, they've had stupendous growth. But a lot of that growth recently was because of the COVID pandemic. As the pandemic eases, and I think this will be the transition year for the pandemic to ease, as the pandemic eases and supply chain disruptions come to an end, the outperformance of the tech stocks and their absolute dominance of how we transact, how we communicate, how we do business together, will begin to fade. And they're priced as if that dominance will continue to grow for the foreseeable future. That's a dangerous assumption.
전기차에 대해서는 어떻게 보시나요? 포드나 GM 같은 전통차들의 반전이 성공할지 아니면 테슬라 천하가 더 지속되는 한 해가 될까요?
Well, their performance as businesses is going to be tremendous. EV is a growth arena. Unfortunately, the market is pricing the stocks as if they're going to grow to be bigger than traditional automakers in aggregate in the not too distant future. We wrote a paper a year ago called the Large Stock Delusion, which looks at sectors like electric vehicles and asks the question, how can you tell when there's a bubble in a sector? And the way you can tell is if all of the stocks are priced as if they're going to succeed, because they compete with one another and they can't all succeed. So if you look at the electric vehicle industry, Tesla early last year was trading at 25 times its annual sales. That was one of the cheapest of the electric vehicle makers. My goodness, that doesn't make sense at all. They were all priced as if they were going to succeed. And then look at the major manufacturers. Toyota has tremendous investment in electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. They know that market. And so the notion that they won't be a serious competitor, come on, of course they will. Same thing holds true of many of the European brands, and Ford itself has launched an investment in construction of electric vehicles that dwarfs anything that Tesla could raise in terms of putting money to work in that arena. So the electric vehicle specialists have a head start, and it's a big head start. But don't discount the possibility of established major automakers carving out a competitive landscape and a decent market share in electric vehicles in the coming 5 years. They're priced as if it'll never happen, but it will happen to some extent. So we could see Tesla 10 times its current size in 10 years and underperform the market over that same 10 years, even if it grows tenfold. Is it likely to grow tenfold? I don't think so. Is it likely to grow several fold? Yes, but you'd need 20 or 30 fold growth to justify today's price.
2022년 필요한 투자 전략은 무엇이 있을까요? 최근 골드만삭스는 기업을 고를 때 높은 수익 마진과 낮은 노동력 코스트를 주목하라고 말했습니다. 투자 종목을 고를 때 어떤 기업을 주목하면 좋을까요?
I would disagree. Stocks with high margins are already expensive. They're already priced at premium multiples. I would look for more conventional value stocks. Good example would be energy. The notion of buying oil stocks is anathema. People think with global warming, how dare we consider buying these stocks? But currently, roughly 80% of all energy worldwide comes from petrochemicals, from oil-based products. And the most optimistic scenarios are that drops to 70% in 10 years and 60% in 20 years. It'll still be the majority of energy production worldwide in 20 years. So we're going to be living with petroleum products for a very, very, very long time. And that means that reliance on this source of energy requires that these companies continue to invest and build production capabilities. By the way, that 60% reliance in 20 years, that actually uses more petroleum-based products than today because the energy demands will be that much more. So renewables are our future, but it's going to take a long time to get there. And in the interim, these stocks are out of favor. They're cheap relative to the underlying price of oil. And so I think they're likely to perform very nicely in the coming decade.
지난해는 성장주가 가치주를 크게 앞서가는 한 해였습니다. 하지만 최근에는 가치주가 다시 주목받고 있는데 앞으로의 흐름은 어떻게 전망하시나요?
It's high-priced relative to a year ago. It's not high-priced relative to the underlying fundamentals. It was an extraordinary bargain a year ago. It's sensibly priced, verging on a little cheap today. It's not a bargain, but it's not unattractively priced. Financial services may also see some good returns in the years ahead. So the value segments of the market are the place to be. They're out of favor, they're unloved, they're inexpensive. People, by human nature, people like to buy what's given them profits and joy.
Right.
And anything that's newly overpriced will have given people profit and joy. So people are reluctant to sell. Anything that's newly cheap will have gotten there by inflicting pain and losses. This is why people don't like to buy bargains. And yet, if you can train yourself to recognize that past returns are not future returns, then you can train yourself to look at stocks that have fallen and ask the question, are they now cheap? Or is there room for them to fall further? Stocks that are newly expensive, you can ask yourself, are they now expensive enough that I should take some profits? Are they so expensive that it's time to start avoiding them? These are questions most investors don't ask, and they should. So being willing to trade contrary to those who chase trends is a wonderful way to earn long-term profits.
숨어있는 가치주는 어떻게 하면 찾을 수 있을까요?
Again, there's a little bit more specific. We invented the concept of fundamental index back in 2004. Fundamental index-based strategies are available through organizations like Schwab and Invesco and PIMCO, many of them in ETF form that can be accessed by Korean investors seeking to use US domicile ETFs to gain access to these markets. And fundamental index tilts you towards deep value, not just value, but deep value. And so I'm very optimistic that these strategies will perform extraordinarily well in the 2020s. Well, fundamental index weights companies by how big their business is. The market weights companies by how valuable their stock is. So if one stock is twice as expensive as another, that is to say its price earnings ratio is twice as high, then the market is clearly saying the growth prospects are better for the stock that's higher priced. But in order to beat the market, it has to exceed those aggressive growth expectations. In order to perform badly, the value stock has to go worse than the market's bleak expectations. So if the growth stock grows, but not as fast as people expect, if the value stock disappoints, but not as much as people expect, the prices move this way. And so you wind up winning with a value bias. So you have this natural built-in buy low, sell high discipline. These strategies have performed far better than passive value indexes, but they are value oriented. So when value struggles, these will struggle by less. When value wins, these will win by more. I think this is going to be a decade for value. So I'm expecting value to win and these strategies to win by more.
한국의 개인 투자자들이 최근 미국 ETF에 상당히 많이 투자하고 있는데요. 이에 대한 투자 조언 부탁드립니다.
Most ETFs are index ETFs. That is to say, you construct an index and then you track that index. But the index doesn't have to be a capitalization market portfolio. That was the essence of smart beta, creating indexes that track interesting new ideas that can beat the market. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The market can't beat itself. The index funds track the market. So take away the index funds and what's left? The same portfolio.
Right.
What do the active managers own? The same portfolio. So active managers cannot collectively beat the market. That doesn't mean that some active managers can't win if others underperform. And in fact, most do underperform. So the opportunity to add value, if you have a strategy that exploits the mistakes of other active managers, the opportunity to add value is very real. The fundamental index strategies and the fundamental index ETFs all have outperformed the value indexes by a wide margin. That's wonderful. They outperform because they don't chase fads. When value underperforms, most value managers get scared and they reduce their value tilt when they should increase it so that when the snapback eventually happens, it's a big snapback in their performance. We do the latter. And so the opportunity to add value is very real. Buying a conventional passive index fund, it's okay. You're going to participate in the market. But buying something that's designed to exploit vulnerabilities of other active managers is a way to produce better returns.
일각에서는 고수익을 노리고 레버리지 ETF 상품에 쏠림 현상이 나타나는 것을 우려하고 있습니다. 유동성 회수가 커지는 상황에서 이런 레버리지 투자는 어떻게 보시나요?
These ETFs, the leveraged ETFs, are specifically designed for traders. The leverage has a cost, and the cost is not just the interest rate on the leverage. The cost is also that if that market goes up, you have to buy more of it in a leveraged portfolio because it's gone up. If it goes down, you have to sell more of it. So the leveraged ETFs have this performance chasing angle in their day-to-day trading, which means that TQQQ will generally not produce 3 times the return of QQQ. Now, you have an added problem. QQQ is utterly dominated by the FANG stocks.
Right.
The FANG stocks comprise half of the index. So if they're overpriced, let's suppose the FANG stocks drop 25%. A triple leveraged QQQ would then be down 75%. And then some because of the added cost of leverage, because of the added cost of rebalancing to maintain that triple leverage. And so the risk is you're down 75%, 80%, 85%. In an ordinary bear market for tech stocks, 25% is not a big drop for these companies.
네.
So I think the Qs are a little dangerous. I think the leveraged Qs are more so.
그렇다면 현재 저평가되고 있는 투자 부분은 어디라고 보시나요?
The cheapest markets are value stocks in emerging markets and in developed ex-US markets. Emerging markets debt is also interesting. The US and other developed economies can engage in massive monetary intervention to force interest rates to zero and hold them there for years. Emerging economies can't do that. They would lose credibility in world markets if they did that. Look what's happened in Turkey with their efforts to hold interest rates down. The result is hyperinflation. And so in the emerging economies, the interest rates are actually a little higher in investment grade emerging markets, local currency denominated, than they are in US junk bonds, where there's a reasonably high risk of default. That's strange. Right. So to the extent that I want to own bonds, I like emerging markets debt. To the extent I want to own stocks, it'll be a globally diversified balanced value portfolio.
과거 비트코인에 대해서 내가 이해하지 못하는 물건은 사지 않는다라고 말씀을 하셨는데 지금은 어떻게 평가하시나요?
Well, firstly, Bitcoin has no practical value. What is a Bitcoin? It's bits on a computer somewhere. So the measurable value, you could do discounted cash flow. Well, it doesn't generate cash flow. So Bitcoin has no value whatsoever other than what people want to pay for it. It's valuable today because the world is taking a no confidence vote in the leaders and central bankers who manage our economy and manage our currencies. So that no confidence vote means I want my money out of dollars. I want my money out of yen, out of euros. What do I put it in? So what about putting my money into Bitcoin? Hey, it's a new currency. And just like $100 bill has no value other than what people think it's worth, Bitcoin is like money in that regard, but money is supposed to be a stable store of value across time, a means of measuring the value of goods and services. If you have a currency, Bitcoin, that goes up and down in big ways, day to day, month to month, that's not a currency. That's not a useful money. So if somebody wants to put some money into Bitcoin, if it'll help them sleep better at night, go for it. And I'd say the same thing about gold. Gold's value is the same as it was 2,000 years ago in terms of purchasing power. It's been said that in Roman times, 1 ounce of gold would buy a very high quality toga. Today, it'll buy a very high quality men's suit or a reasonably high quality men's suit. So same purchasing power after 2,000 years. How much money did you make out of it in 2,000 years? None. But it goes up when people are afraid. If people fear geopolitical instability, if people fear inflation, if people fear expropriation of their wealth by their own central government, gold is a go-to asset. Bitcoin has joined that group as a go-to asset for those who are fearful. If fear is dissipating, they don't do very well.
개인적인 질문인데 혹시 비트코인을 갖고 계시나요?
A fun question. My son is investing in Bitcoin. Back in 2019, he decided to put half his money in Tesla and half of his money in Bitcoin. He had a wonderful 2020. In 2013, I noticed Bitcoin. I thought maybe I should put $100,000 in Bitcoin just as an experiment. But instead, I decided I don't understand Bitcoin, so I'll just buy one Bitcoin. It cost $220. It's today worth a lot more than $220. But if I'd put $100,000 into it, that would now be worth $20 million. So
that would be a different story then.
Exactly.
Right. 마지막으로 한국 투자자들을 위한 조언 부탁드립니다.
Firstly, don't chase popular, trendy, high-flying companies. Put your money in companies with serious profits, seriously large profits, dividends, sales. Goldman Sachs is right on the notion that you want companies with good profit margins, but don't chase the ones with the highest profit margins, because those profit margins will come down in the years ahead. And so you have an opportunity to buy a decent quality portfolio of unloved companies very cheap today. And those companies, those holdings, are much more likely to give you a good rate of return in the years ahead. Our estimate is that the real return on emerging markets value stocks will be over 10% per year for the next decade above inflation. And the return for US growth stocks over that same 10 years will be about 2% below inflation. So that's a big spread. That represents a great opportunity to reposition portfolios.
Okay. Thank you once again for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed this a lot.
Okay. I hope we can talk in near future again.
Absolutely.
I hope all is well and thank you.
Thank you.
이런 말이 있습니다. 주식시장을 짧게 보면 보팅머신, 투표 기계지만 길게 보면 웨잉머신, 저울이다. 그러니까 주식 투자는 단기적으로는 유행과 인기에 따르지만 장기적으로는 그 기업의 본질 가치를 판단해 투자해야 한다는 의미일 텐데요. 벤저민 그레이엄이 한 투자 명언입니다. 기업의 본질 가치를 꿰뚫어 보는 해안이 길러지는 한 해가 되길 저 또한 바라봅니다. 함께해 주신 여러분 고맙습니다.